One of my favorite Old Testament stories is the story of Joseph. Now, if you've been around the church for very long at all, you've probably heard the story of Joseph. It's the perfect story for a whole sermon series. Entire weeks of church camps and vacation Bible school themes have been built around Joseph. Even if you haven't been in the church for long, you've probably heard this story. There's multiple books and even movies based on the story of Joseph. We love this story because it is a roller coaster of emotion and adventure. It all starts in Genesis chapter 37, when we see that Joseph is born the 11th son of Jacob. Not only is he the baby, but he's the only son given to Jacob from his beloved wife, Rachel. And so he is certainly preferred. Maybe you remember the coat of many colors. Well, Joseph begins to have these dreams that kind of indicate he has some kind of authority over his brothers and even his father and mother. And silly Joseph, he tells his brother about these dreams, and they don't really like that. So they begin to make this plan to get rid of their brother. First, they think they're going to kill him and make it look like an accident. Then they decide they'll throw him in a well. But eventually, they end up selling him into slavery. We pick up Joseph's story in chapter 39, and we see that Joseph has ridden the roller coaster from being the favorite, and now he's a slave in Egypt. But Joseph begins to work his way up. He shows that he's reliable and responsible and a really good leader, and so he finds himself in Potiphar's household. Potiphar was kind of second in command to the Pharaoh, and he put Joseph over his whole household. The problem is that Potiphar was not the only one who noticed Joseph. So did Mrs. Potiphar. And she makes some unsightly claims, and Joseph finds himself in prison. Well, in chapter 40, while he's in prison, he does the same thing. He kind of shows that he's responsible, he's a leader, and so he gets to oversee some of the prisoners. He meets two servants of the Pharaoh while in prison, the cupbearer and the baker. Joseph ends up interpreting some of their dreams, and they come true. And when the cupbearer is reestablished to his position, Joseph says, "Hey, don't forget about me." Well, he does for a time, but in chapter 41, guess who starts having dreams? Pharaoh. And nobody can figure out what they mean. The cupbearer, of course, remembers Joseph. Joseph's brought to Pharaoh, and he tells him, "Your dreams mean that you're about to experience 7 good years. You're going to have plentiful crops, plenty of food, plenty of grain to feed everyone, but then there will be 7 years of famine. And so what you need to do, Pharaoh, is you need to put someone in leadership to take care of all of this and store away food in the good years so everyone will have something to eat in the rough years." And Pharaoh decides who better for that than Joseph. So now we come back up to the top of the roller coaster. Joseph is now second in command. And over the next several chapters, 42 to 44, we see Joseph overseeing the food that's given out to the people in Egypt, but also the surrounding area. And lo and behold, guess who comes looking for food but his brothers, the very ones who sold him into slavery years before. Now, Joseph recognizes his brothers, but they don't recognize him. And through a few interactions and some back and forth, Joseph finds out that he has another brother, a younger brother, Benjamin, also born from his mother, Rachel, that he's never met. So he orchestrates a plan for them to bring Benjamin to him, and eventually he finally reveals his identity to his brothers. There's much weeping, there's forgiveness that's offered, and the story kind of ends in chapters 45 through 50 as Jacob's entire family moves to Egypt, and they are cared for by Joseph until the day he dies. Like I said, we love this story. It's an epic tale, and we love it because it's a story of fortitude and faithfulness and forgiveness. It's got moments of sorrow, but also gladness, suspense, and surprise. It's everything that you would want, and it's worth telling over and over again. And with such an epic story, you would think that Joseph is the son of Jacob who ends up in the line of Christ, right? It just makes sense. But actually, no. If you'll look back at Matthew chapter 1 with me, verse 2, we see that it says Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of not Joseph, but Judah and his brothers. Judah. Maybe you don't really remember much about Judah. I mean, if you're anything like me, the other brothers just kind of blend together in the midst of Joseph's epic story. But I want to start our session today by giving you 2 pictures of Judah from either end of the text, either end of Joseph's story. First, from chapter 37, when the brothers plot against Joseph. Here's what it says in verse 19. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and to take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern that was empty. It had no water. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." And his brothers agreed. Now, some have made the argument that Judah was actually trying to save Joseph here, that he didn't want the boy to die, and so this seemed like the way out. The problem is that we're shown Reuben is the one with a plan to save Joseph. And apparently Reuben was not with the crew of brothers when they actually sold him into slavery. We see that he comes back to free his brother from the cistern, but he's too late. So there's a clear contrast laid out for us between Reuben and Judah. Reuben genuinely cared for his little brother, as annoying as he was, but Judah genuinely cared for himself. I mean, why only kill the boy and just be free from his bragging? Why not be free of the boy and make a little cheddar on the side? His motives are clear. Now that's vignette number 1, but now let's go toward the end of the story. In Genesis chapter 44, the brothers have made their second trip back to Egypt, bringing Benjamin along as Joseph commanded. Joseph has his servant put his own silver cup in the grain sack that belongs to Benjamin. Then he sends his brother on the road, and then quickly after sends his servant to stop them as if they have stolen the cup. Now Joseph's plan is to arrest Benjamin and bring him back so that he can spend some time with him, getting to know this kid brother that he didn't even know he had. And so when confronted as thieves, though, the brothers, they deny the accusation. "Why would we do that?" they ask. "Why would we dishonor the ruler of Egypt who's been so very kind to us?" And so they tell the servant, "If one of us has the cup in our bag, we will become your personal slaves." And the servant agrees. So let's pick up the text in verse 11. It says, "Each of them quickly lowered his sack to the ground and opened it. Then the steward proceeded to search, beginning with the oldest and ending with the youngest. And the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. At this, they tore their clothes. Then they all loaded their donkeys and returned to the city. Joseph was still in the house when Judah and his brothers came in, and they threw themselves to the ground before him." Verse 16. "What can we say to my lord?" Judah replied. "What can we say? How can we prove our innocence? God has uncovered your servant's guilt. We are now my lord's slaves, we ourselves, and the one who was found to have the cup." Now look at the language here. These brothers know that if their father loses another son that was given to him by his beloved wife Rachel, he will most certainly die of grief, and they cannot let that happen. But Judah is specifically elevated as the leader of the brothers here, and I cannot help but hear the agony in his response. He says, "We are innocent of this act, the stealing of the cup." But then he recognizes, but we're not completely innocent. God has uncovered my guilt. See, Judah has stolen before. He stole the life of Joseph. He stole Joseph's life from Joseph, but also from their father. And in return, when he did that, what did he receive? Silver. So this weight is heavy upon him. And in verse 33, we see his act of repentance. He says, "Now then, please, let your servant," he's talking about himself here, "let your servant remain here as my lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see that misery that would come upon my father." Judah says, "Take me instead. Let the boy go free, because he cannot face his father again and tell him that by his hand, his father has lost another son." And so even though Judah has a wife and children of his own waiting for him in Canaan, he begs Joseph to make him a slave and send Benjamin home. Now, one could argue that this is purely just the response of guilt and shame here, and I'm sure that there is some of that, But I also believe there is evidence of a changed man. Because see, Judah has lived a lot of life between chapter 37 and chapter 44. How do I know that? Well, did you notice that in my retelling of Joseph's story, I skipped over chapter 38? Yeah, we do that. Unfortunately, it's a pretty common occurrence when we're studying the story of Jacob and Joseph, because chapter 38 is really hard to read. Chapter 38 it's kind of hard to interpret. It's even harder to apply. But it's in chapter 38 that we meet our first woman in the lineage of Jesus, and with her comes the moment that made Judah a changed man. So let's take a look at chapter 38. Here's what it says starting in verse 1. At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. There, Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and made love to her, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. Okay, couple things here. So Shechem is where the family of Jacob lived, and Adullam is where Judah went to. And these two places were quite some distance apart. And so it deserves the question, did Judah just need a change of scenery here? Why did he leave? I think it's likely that he couldn't stand to be around his brothers anymore. Every time he looked at them, he thought of the brother that he had betrayed. It's also likely that he couldn't look his father in the face anymore and see the pain that he had caused him. Now, we can't know that for sure, but it's a pretty decent guess. But look at this. Judah not only leaves their land behind, but also their customs, their practices. Because see, Isaac and Jacob were also in foreign territory when they were married, but they went to great lengths to find Israelite wives, but not Judah. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 7, God instructs the Israelites that when they begin to defeat other nations, they should not intermarry with them. Here's what the text says. Do not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods. And the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. Now, yes, this law in Deuteronomy comes after the story of Judah, but one can't help but wonder if the marriage of Judah and his wife kind of served as a case study to defend this law, because this union produces some serious problems. Verse 6. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, and so the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the child would not be his, so whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, and so the Lord put him to death also. Oh boy. Okay, so much to unpack here. First of all, Tamar. Now, her ethnicity is not revealed to us directly in the text, but it's safe to assume that she was also a Canaanite, just like Judah's wife that he had taken for himself. Because at this point, why would Judah bring another Israelite into his home? He's not exactly following God's law. Second, we have And we don't know what wickedness was so vile that God chose to smite this man. Maybe it had something to do with him worshiping the gods of the Canaanites. Maybe he was just really wild and had no respect for anyone. But whatever the evil was, God clearly did not want that bred into the Messiah's family line. Which, guys, that's really saying something considering some of the other people who made it in. And finally, what's the deal with Onan? Well, first of all, Judah asks him to fulfill his duty to Tamar, his brother's wife. Now, this is a custom that also became law to the Israelites a little bit later on, but it's also a custom that the Canaanites might have practiced as well, because it was pretty common in clan culture. Here's what the Levirate marriage law says in Deuteronomy chapter 5. It says, if brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow should not marry outside the family, but her husband's brother should take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears will carry on the name of the dead brother so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. Okay, so with death, this is now Onan's responsibility. But it would seem that Onan's character is not much better than his brother's because he has no problem fulfilling the first part of his father's request, sleep with Tamar. But he rejects the second part, actually providing her an heir. Because he knows that that first heir will, for all intents and purposes, it will be his brother's son. And this means that that child will receive his brother's inheritance. But if Tamar doesn't conceive an heir, then that inheritance will go to him. Like I said, a real peach. And so God takes Onan out of the equation as well. But the good news is there's still one more brother. So let's keep reading, verse 11. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, I want you to go and live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's household. Well, this is not good. Tradition would have had Tamar stay in Judah's household and wait for Shelah to come of age, but he sends her away. Now, here's the deal. She would not have likely been well received back in her father's household, because what this means is she didn't accomplish what she was meant to do, provide an heir for Judah's line. She would have been an embarrassment to her family, which means she would not have been treated well, and Judah knows that. So once again, we see his motives. Pure selfishness, just like his younger years with his brother. He's not thinking about Tamar's fate at all. All he's thinking about is his own household. Apparently, he thinks that Tamar is cursed, and so he does not want to give his last son to her. And the story continues. Some years go by, and Judah's wife dies as well, possibly solidifying his suspicions about Tamar. And even though Shelah is now grown, he never calls for Tamar to return. Verse 12. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. And when Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hira the Adulamite went with him. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that, though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought that she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, Come now, let me sleep with you. And what will you give me to sleep with you? She asked. I'll send you a young goat from my flock, he said. Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it? She asked. He said, What pledge should I give you? Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand, she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After that, she left, took off her veil, and put back on her widow's clothes again. And just like that, the deceiver has been deceived. Tamar, realizing that Judah is not going to give her to his last son, she knows that she is out of options and she's out of luck. She would be condemned to a life of widowhood for the rest of her life, and this is a terrible fate in this day, but even more so for a sonless widow. Without anyone to take care of her or to protect her or provide for her, it would only be a little bit of time before she's left with only 3 options: slavery, prostitution, or death. And what kind of options are those? But she was promised a future by Judah. And so she decides that if he's not going to willingly keep his end of the bargain, she will make him keep it. Now, there is some scholarly debate here as to why Judah was so apt to engage a prostitute. Some point to this long-standing tradition of shepherds and farmers in Canaan visiting fertility cults before planting, or in this case, shearing. And part of the worship practices would mean that there would be shrine prostitutes available there. Now, Tamar, being a Canaanite, she would have been very familiar with this, so maybe she just went and decided to try her luck. But others have argued Judah must have had some habit of entertaining prostitutes, and Tamar would have known that, so she devised this plot. But it could simply be that Tamar heard his wife had died, and she just thought it would be easy to seduce a man with needs that are now going unmet. But whatever the case, her plan worked like a charm. And she not only convinces him to sleep with her, which, by the way, didn't take a whole lot of convincing, but she convinces him to give her his seal and his staff as temporary payment. Now, this seal would have been Judah's mark. He would have used this seal to sign documents, to make transactions, and this staff was probably marked with the seal or something similar that showed it belonged to Judah. She takes what scholar Robert Alter calls all of Judah's ancient Near Eastern credit cards, and another commentary adds, and his driver's license too. This is a very big deal. And once the deed is done, Judah goes on to shear his sheep, none the wiser, and Tamar goes home and waits. Now, Judah does send payment back to receive his seal and his staff, but surprise, there's no sign of the shrine prostitute. Until a few months later, when she emerges. Verse 24. About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law, Tamar, is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant." Judah said, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said. And she added, "See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are." Judah recognized them at once and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah." And he did not sleep with her again. Now, some have labeled Tamar's act as one of revenge. Others have said, no, it was an act of justice. But I think we need only look to Judah and let him be the judge. Because, see, he knows all about revenge. His little brother Joseph had won their father's heart, and he bragged about being the favorite. And in today's culture, a sibling might kick Joseph in the shins or call him a name, but not Judah. Judah sold his brother into slavery. So yes, he knows a thing or two about revenge. But when Judah sees what Tamar is doing here, rising up and taking leadership over providing heirs for his family because he failed to do so, he doesn't call it revenge. He calls her righteous. And so this story ends with the birth of their twins. Zerah stuck out his hand first, and so the midwife tied a red yarn around his wrist so that they would know. But in a turn of events, the younger brother wrestles his way forward, and so actually Perez was the firstborn. And perhaps this is a foreshadowing for Judah, to show him that though he is older, his younger brother is going to come out on top. Well, as I said before, this is a hard story to swallow. It's no wonder that we often just stick it to the side as we walk through the epic script of Joseph's life. But I do think there are a few lessons that we as followers of Christ can learn from the story of Judah and Tamar. And here's the first one. And I see the evil present in the lives of Judah's sons. And we're aware of what Judah is capable of, so maybe it's not so surprising that his sons would have terrible character. I don't know. But I think what's so jarring to me is that this is the chosen line of the Messiah. This is the family through whom Christ will be born. And we're seeing this steep decline in righteousness that will be reclaimed by some in the family tree, but will only be made worse by others. Now, friends, we have been set apart. We have been chosen by God. We have been asked to stand up in our culture, to be a light in some very dark places. And so I just want to encourage us to let this story be a reminder to us that one deliberate sin often leads to another, and another, and another. And I, for one, do not want my story to be summed up in a single line, but she was wicked in God's sight, and so the Lord put her to death. Here's the second thing I notice. There's something about Judah's inability to see clearly. He didn't recognize Tamar. Now, I understand it had been a few years since they had seen each other, and she had her face covered in veils. I get that. But he also doesn't recognize his brother, Joseph. Later on in the text, when the brothers return to Egypt, they don't know who he is. And again, yes, I get it. It was even longer since he'd seen his brother. And Joseph was a boy when they sold him into slavery. Now he's a man. And when you sell your brother into slavery, you don't expect him to become royalty. I understand all of that. But I still think there's a lesson here. Because Judah just can't see. He couldn't see that the loss of his own sons echoed the loss that he had caused his father. He couldn't see the double standard in his command to have Tamar burned alive for supposed prostitution when he had most definitely sought out a prostitute. He couldn't see anything until he was face to face with the blood on his own hands. That seal and that staff were undoubtedly his, which means that those children inside of Tamar were undoubtedly his. And I can't help but wonder if all of this reminded him of the bloodied cloak that he shoved in the face of his father. Also his act. And so at long last, finally, we see this man who's been sleepwalking through sin begin to wake up. But brothers and sisters, my prayer is that we stay awake and alert, and that it might not take so many signs before we see our error and repent fully. And what about Tamar? Well, she, like Joseph, experienced some very difficult moments. She was on quite the roller coaster. She was married off to an evil man, and then she was given to his possibly even more detestable brother. And then she was lied to and offloaded by her father-in-law, and who knows what treatment she received when she was away from her home. But in the midst of all of this, Tamar knew what was right. She knew what was supposed to be. And so while her actions are questionable, sure, this does not seem to be an act of vengeance, but of vindication. At the end of Joseph's story in chapter 50, we see that Jacob has died. And apparently, Joseph's brothers are still pretty afraid of him. They're not sure what he'll do now that their father's out of the picture. But after all that he's been through, here's what Joseph says to his brothers. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Now, Tamar experienced harm at the hands who should have loved and protected and provided for her. But she stayed the course. She stayed true to her responsibilities, and in the end, she was blessed by God to be the mother of an ancestor of Jesus. She was blessed to earn her place in the family tree. Now, while my prayer for all of you is that you will never be mistreated or forgotten or neglected or taken for granted, but chances are we're all going to experience those drops in our own roller coaster from time to time. And so in those seasons, here's our encouragement from Tamar's story. Let's seek the wisdom of Joseph and the heart of Tamar. And may the Holy Spirit grant us peace and patience and persistence as we work to trust the one who can use it all for good.